Hello, everyone. I'm Joe from Create Context, and this is the Criterion 40. Each week, we look at a different film in Criterion's collection's 40th anniversary Blu-ray collection. This week, we are talking about the 1962 French film Jules and Jim. Jules and Jim is a French new wave movie about the life and love of three people around the time of World War I. Francois Truffaut directed this film, and aside from Jean-Luc Godard, may be the most important name in the French New Wave. His other films like The 400 Blows and Breathless may have been more influential, but there are few films that captured the essence of the French New Wave like Jules and Jim. Jules and Jim has gone on to inspire countless other forms of art and media, everything from literature to the films of Martin Scorsese to even some video games, all have a direct link to Jules and Jim. This is a fascinating film with some excellent performances, even if the narrative, in my opinion, takes a few unearned turns. Jim is the closest we have to a lead character in the film, though the movie follows closely three main characters. Jim is a Frenchman and an author who spends his days and nights hanging around with his best friend, Jules. The two are inseparable, reveling in their youth and career in the arts. Both men desperately seek the affection of women and, more often than not, find a young woman to share a bed with. They eventually, though, meet Catherine, an enigmatic, beautiful young woman who hasn't a care in the world. What begins to look like kind of a standard love triangle type film soon transforms into something more dire. When World War I breaks out, both Jules and Jim are forced into their country's respective armies to fight one another. Before they leave for war, Jules and Catherine actually marry, forcing Jim to always wonder what might have been. Jules is the meeker of the two mains, but he loves Catherine dearly. He spends his time during the war fearful of harming Jim and desperately missing his beloved wife. On leave, Jules gets Catherine pregnant, and once the war is over, the three start a quiet life together in the German countryside, at least as quiet as life can be expected from a woman like Catherine. It's here in this section after the war that the film really begins to delve into its themes and ideas. Jim, after the war, comes to visit Jules and Catherine at their home and realizes his love for her still exists, never left. Despite his satisfaction with his career and even a lover in Paris, Jim is smitten with Jules and his seemingly idyllic wife. This all comes forbearant when Jules jokingly states to Jim that, hey, you won the war, and Jim replies, but I would have rather won all this, gesturing to his wife, child, and peaceful country life. Catherine is the central point of turmoil for both Jules and Jim, not just in the traditional sense of a love triangle, but in the way she lives her life. Catherine is spiteful. She's prone to boredom and willing to abandon her husband and child at the drop of a hat when something or someone more fun comes around. It's totally antithetical to the Jules character and his lifestyle. Jules spends his days working on his writing and caring for his daughter. It's a peaceful life full of love and tranquility, but miles away from the excitement that Catherine craves. Jim's arrival throws drama into their peaceful life, one that Catherine clamors for and Jules merely tolerates. While Jules is certainly happy to see his old friend, he knows Jim's place in their lives will be tumultuous to his and Catherine's marriage. Jules, though, is undeterred and gives Jim his blessing to pursue Catherine, stating he would rather love her from afar than have to face life without her. Jules understands that Catherine is never going to be the woman to settle down and enjoy this peaceful lifestyle that Jules loves so much, but the only way he thinks he can keep her around is by forcing her into the arms of another. Catherine's portrayal here by Jean Moreau is a captivating one. She steals every scene she's in and makes the audience love her as much as Jules and Jim love Catherine. Early on in the film, the camera pauses on various shots of her face. It's a distinctly French new wave cinematography technique, but one that highlights both her beauty and her personality. These small snapshots of her close up are a way to connect the audience to the character, to see her charm the way Jules and Jim do. It's an effective tool and a defining characteristic of this movement in cinema. It's also an effective tool because it comes before all of Catherine's later escapades. During a late night stroll leaving the theater, Catherine becomes annoyed with Jules and Jim's conversation. After making her displeasure known, Catherine leaps several feet into a river running below them. It's both a subtle hint to the film's climax and a direct omen to Catherine's spontaneous actions. She literally leaps before she looks. A signature of the French New Wave is the editing and visual styles. These directors were all experimenting heavily with how a film should look and feel. The film, Jules and Jim, doesn't just use these techniques to make a scene look interesting, but to add to the overall narrative of the movie. The way Catherine is shot at the beginning of the film, it's soft and it's serene. The film then looks at her more harshly as the narrative progresses, and we start to see her more manic tendencies. The camera, like Jules and Jim, want to tame Catherine, but neither can. She is too free a spirit, too headstrong for her own good, and always just a bit out of reach for them and for us. While this is an amazing movie, I would never argue that, and it's one I enjoy quite a bit. This is my second time watching the film, and there are still some narrative choices at the end that I find kind of hard to connect with. This entire movie centers on the relationship between these three people, and it eventually ends in tragedy, as we knew it would. But the tragedy feels just a little bit out of left field. I would have preferred a resolution that leaned harder into heartbreak than full-on Shakespearean tragedy. It gives the entire film this soap opera type quality that isn't really present in the first two acts. The film does allude to Catherine's violent tendencies earlier in the film, but her final act is a choice that I personally didn't see in the character. Catherine is a whirlwind, a rolling stone, as some might say, and maybe even a bit manic, but I never saw her as capable of her final actions. It actually reminds me a bit of two different Kevin Smith movies, if you bear with me on this one. Kevin Smith's first film, Clerks, ended with Dante, the main character, being killed by a mugger at the end of his shift. It was totally random and felt completely out of field for a movie that, up to this point, had just been about a guy having a really awful, terrible day at work. I guess the worst day at work you could have would be one that ends in a mugging and your own death, but still, it didn't work tonally for that film, and Smith wisely chose to recut the ending and remove that from the film, and I think Clerks is much better for it. Had that been the ending, it would have consumed the entirety of the movie. It would have left many audience attendees perplexed and searching for deeper meaning in the ending and the preceding 90 minutes. This isn't an exact one-to-one with Jules and Jim. For sure, Jules and Jim does end on this down note that kind of recontextualizes the whole film. But there are some hints that Catherine is capable of murder, mainly in a scene where she pulls a gun on Jim. That kind of telegraphs the ending to us just a little bit, but it still, in my opinion, softens the theme, the main theme of Jules and Jim, of loving what you can't have, what you can't hold, what you can't control, even though you desperately try to. Jules in this film desperately wants Catherine, but knows he will never be enough for her. So he exists in agony, raising who is presumably their child. That's kind of left a little bit ambiguous, while his wife sleeps with his best friend right in their own home. It's a torturous life, but one he finds favorable to a life without Catherine in it. And what does Jules receive for his suffering but more suffering? Jim, on the other hand, is smitten with Catherine, but he knows she is not good for him. She isn't good for anyone, not even herself. But Jim just can't help himself. She has a hold on him, the way she has a hold on so many other men, so many other people in her life. Their inevitable ending, the two of them dying in dramatic fashion and leaving Jules alone with their daughter, is a sad one, but also the melodramatic, over-the-top ending you would expect from frankly, a much worse movie. This brings me to another Kevin Smith movie, Chasing Amy. Chasing Amy almost in some ways feels kind of like a 90s version of Jules and Jim. This movie came out in 1997. It stars Ben Affleck and Jason Lee. They play best friends and co-workers who have started a comic book together, and their life, it gets turned upside down by the introduction of Alyssa, an adventurous lesbian who eventually falls for and ends up dating Ben Affleck's character. This film ends in a tragic manner, but one that's much closer to what you would expect in real life. Affleck's character, Holden McNeil, learns about Alyssa's promiscuous past and essentially self-sabotages their relationship because he feels inadequate. Each character in this movie ends their relationship with one another and are forced to live their lives apart despite desperately wanting to be with each other. Catherine in Jules and Jim is the opposite of Alyssa. Alyssa in Chasing Amy is wise and has put her wild days behind her, ready to settle down and enjoy a life with a partner she loves. Catherine, on the other hand, she will never settle down. That isn't in her nature. But rather than the film giving her a sad ending, one where she ends up alone after destroying two friends' lives, she more or less takes the easy way out, the thing she's been doing her entire life, by ending her and Jim's life and leaving Jules to take care of the mess. While I personally prefer an ending like Chasing Amy, despite how poorly that film has aged in regard to its representation of the gay and lesbian community, I found that ending profound and cathartic. I don't want to say that Chasing Amy is a better movie than Jules and Jim. It's not. Jules and Jim is leagues above this movie. Chasing Amy, it's a rom-com where the guy doesn't end up with a girl. He screws up so bad and is so entirely incapable of being even an adequate partner that he ruins the two most important relationships in his life. He's grown by the end of the film, but at the expense of those he loves the most. And this is the big, sharp difference. Catherine, in this film, she doesn't grow. Instead, she does what she always does. She makes a mess and forces the quiet, ever-patient Jules to pick up the pieces. Jules and Jim has a tragic ending, one that I don't personally connect with all that much. And I think it's because Catherine never pays for her crimes against those who love her. She never gets her reckoning and instead continues to cause havoc until the final end, taking all that she can with her, knowing that Jules will always be the steadfast, reliable one to pick up the pieces. And that's why this movie is a better movie, because it doesn't give us the ending we want. It gives us the ending we know to be inevitable. And I think that is the ultimate meaning of this film, Jules and Jim. How much Catherine uses Jules and Jim to her benefit and to their detriment. She's a force they can't contend with. And when a force like that enters your life, you can be like Jim and suffer the same end, or be like Jules and suffer even longer. But Catherine, she doesn't suffer. She gets what she wants, even in death. And while it may not be an ending that I connect with or personally enjoy, it's one that I immensely respect, and one that makes Jules and Jim such an amazing, important film. Thank you guys so much for hanging out at the Criterion 40. We'll be back on Friday with a weekly movie minute on the movie The Monkey. It's a great movie. Osgood Perkins. I loved it. I think you guys will enjoy it too. If you like this, if you like hanging out, please subscribe. That would be super cool. And I'll see you guys next time. The Criterion 40 is a Create Context podcast. Head over to createcontext.com for more film, reviews, and analysis. Our theme song is Hindsight by Shiloh, provided by the Riot Games Creator Safe playlist. We drop new episodes every Tuesday at 8 a.m.